As someone who has played and enjoyed multiple massively multiplayer online role-playing games, it might seem counterintuitive, but I have come to the conclusion that MMOs are indeed detrimental, if not to the player, but the video game industry as a whole. MMOs have been a staple in the gaming world for decades. They offer players an experience where they realize their fantasies, explore vast new worlds and histories, get lost in deep systems of customization and gameplay, and facilitate a social environment to form lasting relationships with players from all around the world. While these are all positives, if you consider them closely, they will impact you negatively, especially when it comes to your enjoyment of other games and genres in the industry. There is no arguing that MMOs have a rich, immersive, and massive world that players can explore and interact with. While this is a huge draw to the genre, these worlds require a significant time investment to fully unlock, progress through, and finish. Players who get sucked into these worlds often find themselves dedicating days, weeks, and months, and in some cases their entire lives to these worlds. An MMO takes typically about 50 to 100 hours before some would argue the game even starts, whereas a typical single-player game can be completed in 50. And developers of these MMOs will Hansel and Gretel you through 100 hours with breadcrumb after breadcrumb until you realize just how much time has passed, and you seem to always be just getting started. This leaves very little time for exploring other games, which limits the diversity of experiences that one can have in the gaming world. For me personally, my prime gaming years were spent in EverQuest and World of Warcraft, missing out on the Fallout, Halo, Elder Scrolls, and Witcher series of games, which now I immensely regret not experiencing at their initial release. Now I have to actively find time in my busy days as a father, full-time employee, and aspiring content creators to play these games. I hypocritically still have a hard time staying away from these MMOs, and I find myself getting lost in them during my spare time for months at a time. Not to mention researching, watching videos, and learning about future MMOs, as it always feels like I'm missing out on significant occurrences, and the fear of missing out helps drive this addiction. MMOs are addictive. They are designed to be that way. Many players find themselves unable to tear themselves away from the game, even when they have other responsibilities to attend to. This can lead to neglect of other areas in their lives, such as work, relationships, and physical health. And of course, while less important, other multiple games and genres they could be enjoying. While addiction is not unique to MMOs, the immersive nature of these games and their systems can make it especially difficult for some players to maintain a healthy balance. It's important to note that addiction is a complex issue that can't be solely attributed to a single form or factor. MMOs often have complex systems such as character progression, skills, spells, exploration, questing, and crafting, intertwined with deep lore that spans multiple years of gameplay and expansions. All this comes with a learning curve that one may find overwhelming. And while this might sound like a barrier, MMOs tend to have great tutorials with enough carrot-on-a-stick incentives and dopamine-triggering milestones that players often find themselves even more enthralled. And then the sunk cost fallacy sinks its claws into the player. While this keeps the player in the game, the complex systems mentioned make non-MMOs seem simplistic, shallow, stale, and straightforward in relation to the complexity, depth, massive worlds, and options provided by an MMO. Add the social aspect, and a single-player game now appears lackluster and primitive, to the point that single-player game developers are now implementing arbitrary MMO-light and live game systems to try to attract and hook players. Not to mention the well-entrenched communities of MMO players giving a sense of belonging and are often happy to help and ensnare new players to share their addiction with. And of course, misery loves company in an MMO. Ironically, while these games do allow for socialization with other players, and that is inherently what the underlying fabric of an MMO is, the fact remains that much of the time spent is done alone, virtually grinding and in reality at home. This can lead to a feeling of loneliness and isolation, especially for those who are already struggling with these issues in their real lives. Additionally, the once welcoming online communities that develop around these games can trend to toxic the deeper you delve into them, fueled by the competitive nature of the genre's progression system and metas, and tribal nature, which further causes players to push away from trying other games and genres, as you're not allowed to enjoy two MMOs at the same time. Which is again ironic, as MMOs often suffer from a lack of originality, and beyond aesthetics, they are fairly similar. Many MMOs rely on tired tropes, such as races divided into humans, elves, and dwarves, with their classes split into healer, tank, and damage. Story tropes and arcs of the player being the chosen hero, which can feel stale and overused from game to game. MMOs also tend to follow a similar formula with quest design and implementation, with quest types that are largely interchangeable between different zones in a single game, or even between different games. The sheer amount of these similar quests and mechanics presented to the player can lead to a feeling of sameness that can be difficult to shake. especially when trying to transition to play different games. The dread of going through another leveling grind with another character, let alone another game, often leads players to hunker down and commit long-term to one MMO. This leads to the additive cost associated with the MMO. They can be incredibly expensive, but the cost was so spread out that one wouldn't know it. Most MMOs require players to pay an initial game cost, a monthly subscription fee, and pay for subsequent expansions year after year, which can add up significantly over time. And for those MMOs that don't require a subscription or are free, they will typically hamstring you significantly, leading you into microtransaction after microtransaction that solve barriers purposefully placed to hinder the free-to-play player and force them to pay or suffer. Speaking of microtransactions, MMOs are where the infestation of pay-to-win design in video games has taken hold, and the majority of current leading free-to-play MMOs or MMO lights are the worst culprits of this, which is again another hot-button topic that should make for another good video. Some MMOs tried to combat this. Guild Wars 2 comes to mind. They still ultimately lead the player to an endless game of metas, grinds, and huge time sink. MMOs have been a staple in the gaming world for decades. They offer players an experience where they realize their fantasies, explore vast new worlds and histories, get lost in deep systems of customization and gameplay, and facilitate a social environment to form lasting relationships with players from all around the world. However, MMOs isolate a huge swath of players from the gaming demographic, limiting players' ability to try and enjoy other genres, all the while generating a false sense of loyalty and tribalism, with mechanics designed to monopolize your time, money, and attention. Mechanics that are cascading and infecting the gaming design space, and of course depriving the players themselves from what the industry truly has to offer. At the end of the day, it's ultimately up to the player to pick the game they want to play, and invest hundreds if not thousands of hours and dollars into it. That's their choice. Given the chance, I would go back and reevaluate the thousands of hours and dollars spent into those games. Would you? Hope you enjoyed this video and it gave you some insight. Check out more videos on the channel, subscribe for more content, follow me on Twitch for live streams, and always make time for games.